And welcome back to Leah's Adventures or Leah's Lifestyle, depending on if you're with me on YouTube or here on Twitch. Today we are reading rule number 1, and we are on, if you're using a Kindle, 21%, page 62 of 324. Okay. Your 25-year compound rate of return in Pepsi is 12%. Oh, that's the little... I was like, what is this? Oop. Okay. I kind of got crazy. There we go. The Big Five. If a business has at least one of the 5 moats, it'll show up in the Big Five numbers. These numbers are proof of the existence of a moat. Business without moats do not have good Big Five numbers. If you can't spot good Big Five numbers, I promise you that you're on thin ice of hope is trying to predict the future for that business. The firm may not have the moat or the future you think it does have. You think it does. The Big Five numbers are so important that I never buy a business that has a bad Big Five. Here are the Big Five. 1. Return on investment capital, ROIC. 2. Sales growth rate. 3. Earnings per share, EPS growth rate. 4. Equity or book value per share, BVPS growth rate. 5. Free cash flow, FCF or cash growth rate. Alright. Pause, because I think these are important to write down. All of the Big Five should be equal to or greater than 10% per year for the last 10 years. Return on investment capital, ROIC or ORC or ORI, and it's just all of it. It's written. They rewrite them all that we just said, and it says greater than 10% per year. Okay. Although hundreds of numbers are tracked on financial websites like Yahoo Finance and MSN Money for lots of businesses, these 5 numbers are not always tracked for free. Because rule number 1, investors focus on these 5, I'm going to show you how to, step by step, to create each of these critical growth rate numbers yourself from information that is free. That will be the focus of Chapter 6. First, however, we're going to discuss in the next chapter what each of these 5 numbers tell us and how they help us identify wide moat companies. I'll take some time to get used to these numbers, so be patient. Recall how frustrating learning 2 plus 2 equals 4 was in the first grade? Okay, maybe it wasn't frustrating for you, but you did have to count on your fingers at the start. This is a lot easier than that because we've got computers and calculators to help us out. And then there's a website here. We'll take that note. We'll put it under things we need to research. Chapter 5! We were so close to Chapter 5, man. I should have just ran through it at the end. I don't know why I didn't yesterday. That's alright. The Big 5 numbers. Mankind have a great aversion to intellectual labor, but even supporting knowledge to be easily obtainable, more people would be content to be ignorant than would take even a little trouble to acquire it. That was really good, so I'm going to read it. I'm going to read it a little bit better than what I just read it, because that's actually pretty great. Oh, fuck. Mankind have a great aversion to intellectual labor, But even supposing knowledge to be easily obtainable, more people would be content to be ignorant than would take even a little trouble to acquire it. Who wrote that? Samuel Johnson, 1709 to 1784, quoted in Barrow's Life of Samuel Johnson. I don't know who that is, but that got me, so I'm going to add that person to my people to know list. I'm going to check out who. SamuelJohnson. Okay. Even if we think we can identify the moat in a business without much effort, it doesn't mean we stop there and go on to consider its management, the third M. First, we must confirm the strength of the business by looking at the big 5 numbers. These are the 5 numbers I use to help me determine whether a business can give me at least a 15% return a year. In other words, the big 5 are a huge clue to whether the business is predictable and can be trusted to deliver expected rates of return in the future. Well, also, as an afterthought, glance at debt. I don't consider a company's debt one of the big 5, but it's a number we're going to have to look at once we've checked off the health of the big 5. And usually, if our big 5 are all looking good, debt will too. Remember, all of these big 5 numbers should be equal to or greater than 10% per year for the last 10 years. We must also look at the 5-year and the 1-year numbers and compare those to the 10-year numbers to make sure the business isn't slowing down. But if you want to focus on a few numbers as possible to get used to the evaluation process, you can get started by simply looking at the 10-year average, and if it's above 10%, move on to the next step. Let's consider what each of the big 5 numbers mean. For now, don't worry about where the numbers come from. Focus on the understanding what they mean, and then we'll learn how to arrive at them. ROIC, return on investment capital. ROIC is the rate of return business makes on the cash it invests in itself every year. For example, let's say your kids finance a lemonade stand business with $200 to get it up and running. Their investment capital is the $200. After a week, the kids come back in the house with $300. And after subtracting their expenses of the $200 they paid for the supplies and salaries and flyers they made at Kiko's, their profit is $100. Their ROIC is their profit divided by their invested capital. In this case, they did great. 100 divided by 200 is 50%. Pretty amazing return on just a week. By comparison, if they put 200 in the bank at 2% a year, their investment would have grown by less than 10 cents. Let's see, 100 or 10 cents? Which is better? There's a lesson for your kids in there somewhere. In any case, ROIC is the percentage return you get back from the cash you've plowed into your business. It's a measure of how effectively a company uses the money, borrowed or owned, invested in its operations. As such, it's also an indicator of how effective a company's management team is at using the money invested in its operations. A good, solid ROIC is one of the first indicators that the managers of the business are on the side of its owners, something that's going to be very important as we continue our research. If you were to ask me which of the big five is the most important number, I tell you to go on to ROIC first. If a business doesn't have a healthy ROIC above 10% per year on average for the last 10 years, move on to another business. A business that has a great moat almost always boasts an attractive ROIC because the moat protects against constant price pressure from competitors. In fact, such a moat-protected business forces others to compete on price, In fact, such a moat-protected business forces others to compete on price, which is a hard way to make money. We want to see a long history of great ROIC, at least 10% per year for the last 10 years average. And we don't want to see an ROIC going down. We want to see it going up or at least staying the same. While it's acceptable to just focus on the 10-year average, it's best to look at three numbers for ROIC: 10-year average, the past 5 years, and the last year average. Having all three ROIC numbers gives a better sense of how a company is doing. Let's look at some companies ROIC has of early 2005 and see what they tell us. Refer to the chart on, and it has a page. It'll be over here. These are all pairs of companies that compete with each other. For example, Apollo companies with ITT Educational, Oracle companies with Sabis, General Motors companies, sort of, with Harley Davidson, Whole Foods companies with Albertsons, Dell companies with Gateway. Read the chart from left to right. Look at the 10-year ROIC first, then the 5-year, and finally 1 year. Which of the most is recent? Which one is the most recent year? Obviously, you want to see the number topping 10% in all categories, and it'll be great if they show growth. If they rise as we move from the 10-year average to the 5-year to the 1 year, just based on the ROIC numbers you see here, which companies would you choose to invest in? We can see by comparing the ROIC numbers over time that ROIC is going up or holding steady for Apollo, Harley Davidson, Whole Foods, and Dell. It bounces out Oracle and ITT, but still way above 10% minimum requirement. Sybase has recovered a bit recently. GM and Albertsons are holding steadily lately, but too low for consideration. Gateway's ROIC is dropping like a brick. Remember, we want ROIC to be staying steady or going up. Apollo and ITT are in the education industry. Both show great numbers, and although Apollo is more consistent, Whole Foods competes with Albertsons. The grocery business has really low profit margins to begin with, so giving them some slack for that. But look at the difference in the two companies' ROIC. Whole Foods' ROIC is getting bigger. Albertsons is getting smaller. Who do you think has the moat? Probably Whole Foods, I guess. General Motors and Harley are in similar businesses. Check out GM's low and disappearing ROIC. This is a sign of a company on the edge of going under. Meanwhile, Harley is looking very healthy. How about Dell and Gateway? Who has the moat? Not really a problem answering that one, is there? Dell has built a monster moat that Gateway tried to swim across. Looks like Gateway drowned in Dell's moat. Do you want to put your money in Gateway and hope they use it better than they have in the past? Or do you want to go with something just a bit more predictable, like Dell? I'd go with Dell at the right price. Okay, and then now it's showing the companies down, and it says ROIC 10-year, ROIC 5-year, ROIC 1 year, and Whole Foods is 7, 10, 12, okay. And then there's like negative, like Gateway is negative 10, negative 50, negative 113, while Dell is 43, 43, 42. Albertsons is 9, 6, 6, so that's going down. Okay, Harley Davidson 16, 18, 18. But GM is 311 going down. Cybus is negative 21, negative 24, 12. Came up within the last year, but not predictable. Not over the last 10 years. Does that mean this going down? Because this is the first year, right? Yeah. So Albertsons came up, but not by a lot. No, it's going down. Yeah, okay, that was the way. Interesting. Okay, cool. Unfortunately, for a rule number 1 investor, there's no right place for Gateway. It doesn't meet the moat requirement, which means it doesn't meet the predictability requirements, and therefore we can't make a decision about the business's future. If we can't make that decision, we can't give it a value. No value, no way to know what it's worth today. If we buy it without knowing what it's worth today, we're just guessing that it's cheap and therefore must go up. We can't know that it's cheap since we can't give it value. Therefore, we're gambling, wishing or hoping, whatever you want to call it. It's investing. Isn't investing. See how just a few bits of data led to a very emphatic conclusion? ROIC is not the only number we need to look at to confirm we have a company with a very wide moat. We also need to know that the business is growing for the benefit of us, the owner. For that information, we have to look at 4 growth rates. 1, sales growth rate. 2, earning per share growth rate. 3, equity growth rate. And 4, free cash growth rate. Okay. I think I'm going to write ROIC %, over 10 years, 5 year, 1 year. And then underneath that, I'm going to write a dot. I'm going to say, I don't think these sales growth rate. Wait. What was that website? What was the thing from? Legend to Chart, Paulo. Where did they find this? That's what I want to know, is how did he get this? You just Google it? I guess we'll just Google it. Okay. We'll just have to Google. A googly googly. Googly googly, you know? Okay. Alright. Anywho's, the big 5 numbers are calculated for us on some professional sites, but those sites cost money. Free sites like, oh, this is exactly what I was just asking for. Free sites like MSN Money or Yahoo. Oh, it's Yahoo Finance. Okay. Free sites like MSN Money or Yahoo Finance has some of the big 5 calculated, and then we have to do the rest ourselves from raw data. To make it easy, I put rule number 1 calculators for each of the big 5 on my website. www.rule1investing.com. I already have that written down. But just to show that you could easily divert these growth rates even if my site wasn't available, in the next chapter I'll show you a neat trick for figuring these out in your head. All you need are 10 numbers. All you need are 10 years of numbers. You can get these numbers from sites like MSN Money or possibly your online broker website. if it offers research tools. You may want to become familiar with one site in particular for purposes of learning the ropes of rule number 1 methodology, and then you can experiment with other sites and find the ones you think are easiest. In this book, we'll be using data taken mostly from MSN Money and Yahoo Finance. This doesn't mean you can't access the same information elsewhere. Refer to my website for links to financial data sites. Okay, wow. That was good. Water. The 4 growth rates. We need to find out the sales, EPS, equity, and cash growth rates. These numbers tell us how much the business is growing each year over the previous years and if they're consistent, giving us a huge clue to what rate of growth we should expect in the future. This is critical to figuring out what the business is worth today. Sales are the total dollars the business took in from selling whatever widgets and digits it sells. Your kids' lemonade stand sold $300 of lemonade. That's the sales number. Simple enough. Sometimes sales is referring to as the top line number because it's located on the top line in financial reports about the business, specifically on the income statement. Each year, the business will report its sales and the other numbers as well, which allows us to see if sales grew compared to last year. We like to see the 10 years of numbers to get an idea if sales are growing consistently. If they are, we can calculate the amount of growth above last year. If your kids have $300 of sales this year and next year they have $1,000 of sales, their sales grew by $700. That's nice to know. But the really important number is what the rate of growth is. We just let the computer divide 300 into 1,000. We get 3.33. That means the sales were the same. That's the first one. Plus another 2.3 or 233%. So the sales growth rate for this year is 233%. If we want to calculate the sales growth rate for multiple years, we can do that easily. Let's jump forward in time and pretend the kids had the stand for 5 years. In the 5th year, we check out how the business is doing by figuring out its average growth rate for those 5 years. Business is rocking right along and sales amount to $3,000 for the last year. 5 years ago, sales were only $1,000. The most accurate way to do the calculation is to use my rate calculator, which tells us the growth rate is 25% for those 5 years. The calculator on my website makes this a cinch. I'll take you through the steps of making the calculation roughly in your head or on a paper in the next chapter. We can do the same calculation for the 10 years, 5 years, and 1 year, the most recent year, and see if the rate of sales growth is growing or shrinking. And we repeat that exercise for all 4 growth rate numbers: sales, EPS, equity, and cash. Nothing to it once you've done it a couple of times. Okay, yeah, I'm sure there's nothing to it once you've done it a couple of times. The next number is EPS, earnings per share, which tell us how much the business is profiting per share of ownership. For example, since your kids' lemonade stand has really taken off, they need to buy a lot more supplies to keep up with demand. They're going to need some outside money to do that. And to get that money, the kids can sell some of their ownership. Let's say it's year 7 and they want to sell half of it to you, their dad or mom. First, they make their lemonade stand business into a corporation so they can create lots of little pieces of ownership in the business. Those pieces are called shares of stock. Once they do that, they'll have stock to sell to you. They decide to issue 2,000 shares. They could have decided on any number of shares, be it 10,000 or a million. That wouldn't change the size of the pie, just create more pieces. Next, they have to figure out what the business is worth so they'll know what to charge for a piece of it. Well, for 5 years, the business has been growing its earnings fast, at about 25% a year. Last year, the earnings were 2,000. You tell your kids that if they were a big public company that had a similar track record, lots of fund managers would be happy to pay about 2 times the growth rate, or about 50 times last year's earnings, to own a piece of the business. So, if the business were big and publicly traded, with lots of investors, it'd be worth maybe 100,000. But you point out, it isn't big and it isn't public. So it isn't worth that much to a private investor. Too many risks. Risks along the lines such as, who are you going to sell your pieces to if you want out? Or, since the business is only 5 years old and really small, can it grow at the pace when it gets bigger? And where are they going to get more money if they need it to keep growing at that fast pace? And what happens if management wants to leave and go to high school? That's a good fucking question. So you and your kids agreed the business isn't worth 100,000. It's maybe worth a quarter of that, say 25,000. If the business is worth 25,000, half of it's worth 12,500. So the kids agree to sell half of it to you for 12,500. In exchange for your 12,500, they give you half the issued stock, 1,000 shares. Since you received 1,000 shares of stock in exchange for your 12,500, you paid $12.50 per share of stock. They also issued themselves stock that represents ownership of the other half of the business, so the kids have 1,000 shares too. They didn't pay anything for theirs. They are the founders of the business, and it's common that founders get their stock for free for doing all the work to make it successful. Armed with the 12,500 in investment capital you put in the business, plus the cash surplus they had from earnings of 2,000 over the next few years, your kids continue to grow the business to a point where it now generates 6,000 in earnings per year. Because the business owners, you and the kids, have 2,000 shares of stock, the $6,000 of earnings is divided into 2,000 pieces of $3 each. That's how we get earnings per share, or EPS. In this case, the EPS is $3. EPS is often called the bottom line number because it's usually the last line of the financial statement, specifically on the income statement. Just as with sales, what we really care about right now is the EPS growth rate is. And as with sales growth rate, and the EPS growth rate is the amount of growth from one year to another expressed in a percentage. If the EPS 10 years ago was 10% per share, 100 divided into 1,000 shares, since mom and dad hadn't bought in yet, and the EPS today is $3 per share, and the EPS growth rate calculation tells us that 10-year EPS growth rate is 41% per year. That's a great number. Now we want to know if the owners get to keep the money or whether it's getting spent on a bunch of equipment to create next year's spectacular growth. To find that out, we look at the equity growth rate. Equity is what you and the kids would have left over if the kids sold off everything, paid off any debt, and took the money that was left. If the kids decided they wanted to quit the business, of course they would try to sell it. But if nobody wanted to buy it from them, they could just sell off their supply of sugar and lemons and pay off whatever they owe. Let's say they have 8,000 supplies of lemon, sugar, ice machines, glasses, and tables on hand, plus $10,000 in cash, and a couple of trucks worth of $10,000. That's what's left over from profits and the $12,500 investment after buying more supplies and equipment. Since they don't owe anybody, the equipment totals to $28,800 from selling the supplies, $10,000 from selling the trucks, and $10,000 in cash. You and the kids would split that on a per share basis. Since there are 2,000 shares and $28,000 to split up, each share would get $14. That 14 is called book value per share, BVPS, and the 28,000 is called equity or book value. Some people call it the liquidation value. What the business is worth if it's no longer a business. Okay. Its base value. The raw number itself isn't so important to determine value because business with a lot of real estate and machinery, like McDonald's, can have a huge equity relevant to their value, while businesses that are all about intellectual property, like Google, might have a small equity relative to their value. In other words, equity numbers are vastly different when you contrast a factory-type business with one based on knowledge or intellect. But the rate of equity growth could be identical and is very, very important. It tells us the business can accumulate surplus, and that in itself makes it exceptional. Hence, equity alone isn't nearly as revealing as equity growth rate, which is why we focus more on growth rate than on the number from which we derive the growth. Wow, I did not want to say that word. That didn't want to come out of my mouth. Derive. Whew. I'm gonna go crazy. Goodness. What's so important about equity growth? Some students of mine have asked me this question and wonder why. If equity is really just a surplus, equity growth is a good indicator of company strength. Well, if a business equity, the surplus, isn't growing, the business doesn't have the funds to spend on increasing its market or developing new products. Maybe earnings are simply being channeled back into maintaining the business. For example, by building new manufacturing plants, which may be worthless in 5 years, or maybe the company is pursuing a growth for growth's sake strategy, the sort of purposeless growth usually shown up in a much lower ROIC, meaning the owners, we rule number one investors, are being taken advantage. In the 1934 edition of the Secretary Analysis, author Benjamin Graham explains that most businesses are not able to accumulate much of an equity surplus because they spend everything they earn to maintain the status quo by replacing and or keeping up with what they need to stay in business, equipment, R&D, and so on. Noting this, Warren Buffett began looking for the exception, a business that accumulates more and more surplus every year. Finding these exceptions is the key to rule number one investing. So we look for businesses that accumulate surplus. That's why we track equity growth. It's a very good sign that the business is exceptional. Equity, or book value per share, is also an excellent indicator of the long-term growth of what Mr. Buffett calls intrinsic value, and what I call the sticker price, the rational value of a business. In the Berkshire Hathaway chairman's letter of the February 2005, Mr. Buffett writes, despite their shortcomings, yearly calculations of book value are useful as Berkshire as a slightly understated gauge for measuring the long-term rate of increase of our intrinsic value. Therefore, we look very serious at the equity growth rate to help determine the long-term growth rate and thus the sticker price of a business. We figure the equity growth rate just like sales and EPS growth rates. Back when the kids first sold you stock in their business, after you put in the $12,500, The liquidity in the business was essentially all cash, $14,500. If the business had been liquidated 5 years ago, each share in the business would have been worth $7.25. If the kids decided to liquidate today, 5 years later, the liquidity would be $28,000, and the book value per share $14. We put those two numbers, $14,500 of liquidity value from 5 years ago and $28,000 from today, in our calculator, and it tells us the liquidity or book value growth rate for the last 5 years is 14% per year. Again, I'll be taking you through these calculations in the next chapter. My point here is simply to convey what these numbers mean. I use the term calculator loosely because you'll soon find out how to perform these calculations either through it roughly in your brain or with the help of the accuracy of a real calculator. Finally, cash tells us if the company's cash is aligned with its profits. Cash growth, in particular, tells us whether its cash is growing with its profits or if the profits are only on paper. We like real cash growth. The kids' lemonade business is a great cash biz. There's some machineries to squeeze the lemons, crush the ice, and serve the juice, and there are a few trucks, but that's about it. That means the profit of the business don't have to be reinvested in expending expensive hardware that eventually becomes worthless and has to be replaced over and over. If the business makes a profit, almost all of it becomes cash in the bank. That cash can be used for business purposes, or it can be given to the owner as a so-called dividend, and dividend is just a payout of extra cash the business can't use effectively to grow. Because I'm more or less lazy and prefer to fish than to study animal reports, I really like businesses that can invest the cash for me instead of giving it to me and making me reinvest it myself. Hence, I like businesses that grow fast and don't pay dividends, but I'll give you the lowdown of dividends at the end of this chapter. 5 years ago, your kids' lemonade stand had $1,000 in cash. Today, they have $10,000 in cash. We plug those numbers into our calculators and get 58% for the cash growth rate. Liquidity is more or less the take-home money if a business is not sold on an ongoing business, but instead the machines, supplies, and real estate are sold off. The proceeds of the sales are added to whatever cash the business has in the bank. The debts are paid off, and the remaining cash is divided up among its owners. Liquidity doesn't factor the value of the business as an ongoing money maker, which is an important part of the real worth of any business, and which, as owners, is our own as well. But early growth rate does give us a very good sense of the growth rate of the real value of the business. We can use the number to figure out what is going to be worth in 10 years. For more on liquidity, refer to the glossary. At the end of each quarter, businesses count their cash. Then, the next quarter, they often spend the previous quarter's cash on the replacing capital items such as manufacturing machinery. What's left is called free cash and is used for paying dividends or just having it available for working capital, i.e., money to spend on growing the business. Where are we at right now? I think we're gonna pause there. I think that's a good spot to pause. Okay. I'm gonna end this YouTube video and then we will go on to the next one. Alright guys, we're going to stop there at 25%, page 75 of 324 if you're on a Kindle. Thank you for reading with me today and taking some until next time. Bye!